klicke ich jetzt Go Live. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our today's SAP Community Call. My name is Laura. I'm an SAP Community Advocate and part of the Community and Influencers team. And I will be moderating this call today, which is about Catena-X, industry network and technology for a data-driven value chain. I have two speakers with me today, namely Dr. Daniela Wünsch, who is product expert for industry cloud architecture, and Thomas Obermeier, Chief Development Architect for Industry Cloud Architecture. Welcome to both of you. Happy to have you here. As always, this call will be a 60-minute session, which is now live streamed here in YouTube, and the recording will also be available under the same URL directly after the call. Daniela and Thomas will talk approximately 45 minutes, and we will also have a Q&A session towards the end to address any questions that you might have for both of them. And in order to take part in the chat function and to post your questions there, you should be logged into YouTube in order to post your questions. And with that being said, I'd like to hand it over to both of you, to Daniela, who starts with the presentation.
Okay, great to be here. Thanks, Laura, for the introduction. And maybe let me start with a short motivation from the automotive industry, what this presentation will be about. So you might know in a car, you have more than 10,000 materials and parts. However, today, this high number is known, but it's not known where these parts come from and what is actually included in the single parts, what materials, etc. And it is also not possible that suppliers and also the ODMs in the OEM have the overall overview about the supply chain. Of course, one single participant in the supply chain knows who are the suppliers and what parts are supplied, but they do not know what is in it, right? Nevertheless, this overview is extremely important, in particular in today's time, where the supply chains become volatile due to some things, and we also need to reduce the dependency to specific suppliers or specific countries. So that's why, as answer, we have Catena-X to get this transparency with the digitalization of the supply chain. To give you an intro, Thomas and I will first give you an overview about Catena-X, the goals, the motivation, and so on. Then we will explain the technical foundation and also give an insight into the roadmap and further information. So the main motivation I explained already as the example. Maybe let me go a little bit more in detail. Of course, we need resilient supply chains. So that means they should not immediately break if one supplier is not able to deliver as promised, or if any situation happens you have not foreseen. So that means you need the transparency of your demands and the capacity of the suppliers to know how to react fastly to any situations. Then sustainability and regulatory play an important role. So that means we need to know what CO2 emission is produced in the production of the single parts of the overall car, and what is the carbon footprint in total. If we have this transparency, we can also do some measures to reduce it in the end. So furthermore, we need to try to bring parts back into the supply chain as recycled parts, either during the production or after the use of the car, if they can be reused. Then, of course, there are also regulatories in place. So, for example, the Supply Chain Act, also known as Lieferkettengesetz, which should ensure that, for example, no child labor is involved in the production. So we do not need only the transparency, what is included in a product, in a part, but also where the parts are produced and how. So to get these transparencies, you can, of course, not collect all this data in a central place. So this is not the goal. Catena-X goes a new way of decentralized networks here, which should ensure full data sovereignty. So data sovereignty means that all the data owners, the data providers will share any data with their consumers, can certify the identity of the data consumer and control the terms and conditions under which their data is used. So they can control or individual control the usage for every consumer. So that the data always stays in the responsibility of the owner. To reach this can, of course, not be done by an individual company, but we need to do this together. In this way, also no one of the supply chain has more rights as another one. So OEMs, suppliers, other partners in the supply chains have the same rights. Although I just talked about the automotive industry so far, Catena-X is aimed to improve the supply chain or the transparency in the supply chain in the automotive industry, but the general idea, network, and so on should also be applicable to other networks. So on this slide, you can see who is involved in the supply chain. So far, I spoke about suppliers and OEM, but of course, we also have other partners. We have IoT partners, we have the development partners, financial partners, logistic partners. And last but not least, of course, also the recycling partners who ensure that parts can be reused at any point in the supply chain. All partners or at all partners, data are collected, which are or need to be partly shared with other partners based on a trusted and data sovereign network. Yeah. To address all these things together, 1 year ago, the consortium of Catena-X was founded with 28 partners, which you can see here, in cooperation with the BMW I. As you can see, we have from all the areas partners in the consortium. So we have OEMs, we have bigger companies, smaller companies, we have the ones who adopt the solution in the end, and we have the outfitters, as we are, for example, as SAP. And we have also scientific partners who support the guidance related to Gaia-X and IDSA, what I will explain later on. So besides the consortium, also the association is in place, which has recently got more than 100 members. And the association is there to give some strategic direction, do the validation, what is the outcome of the project, while the consortium is rather doing the research, the developments to reach this goal. So, but the consortium is, the association is really important to validate the success and the outcome, what is developed here. So when the consortium and the association has a common vision and also some guiding principles, which are shown here. First, we said, okay, we need to act together, right? It's not the case that any partner has more rights than the others, but we need to act together to come to the goal of such a decentralized network and ensure that we are strong in the supply chain in total. Then the resulting environment needs to fit for all partners. It doesn't matter if they are outfitters or adopters, if they are smaller or bigger companies or larger companies. That's why we need a user-friendly environment, an easy configurable environment, and to build, operate, and also collaborate in the end-to-end data change. Then a big principle is the openness. So the network has to be open, of course, secure, and ensure data sovereignty and interoperability. That means it needs to be built on the principles of Gaia-X and also the concepts of the IDSA. And I'm not sure if you know Gaia-X, so that's why I will shortly explain. Gaia-X gives the principles to define an open, transparent, and secure digital ecosystem for sovereign data exchange across corporations, industries, but also governments and citizens. And IDSA defines the international data spaces. So it is an association which defines the criteria for any virtual data space, so decentralized ones, to ensure that the data exchange is secure and based on trust. So from the technology point of view, we also want to support openness. So that means that the network should be cloud agnostic, and it should be based on open standard, shared components, and open source developments. Last but not least, Catena-X also wants to influence industry standards in the direction of federated networks, data sovereignty, and business partner data management. So here you can see with 4 use cases Catena-X has started. So the basis is the business partner data management, which has the goal to have one golden record of a business partner, which ensures that there are no duplicates and it's cleaned, let's say, the business partner data. So only a trustable basis of business data ensures that the data can be exchanged in a trusted way. Then also a basis use case is traceability. So traceability means that you know what is included in your product, but also where and how the products and the parts are produced. This traceability is also the basis for other use cases. So the orange dots mean SAP is involved. So for example, for the carbon footprint management, as mentioned already, you need to know what materials are included in the single parts and how it's produced exactly. Then for the quality management, also the traceability is important to ensure any product recalls if necessary, and to ensure that the quality is good over the overall supply chain. And then we have, of course, the circular economy use case where you need to know what is included to reuse parts during the production after the usage of cars and parts of it. And the digital twin means that we need the digital product, but also the digitalization of the process to know what happens there in a digital way. So this slide shows how we organize ourselves. So Catena-X is not just a user research project, but it has the goal to deliver something for the automotive value chain. And that means we also need an agile project setup. So agile project setup should be ensured by the SAFe methodology, so the scaled agile framework methodology. And that means we are divided into so-called agile release trains for different topics. And within these agile release trains, we have products that interact tightly together within such a agile release train, but of course also with the products and the other agile release trains. To ensure the alignment and the cooperation between all the arts and products, we have the portfolio and program management in place. So this should give you a first intro, and with this I hand over to Thomas.
Thank you, Daniela. And yeah, so Thomas Obermeier, my name, and I like to give you more insights into the architecture that we're building here as Daniela said, we are set up in a agile mode where we work in this scaled agile framework methodology, and my role is between some other architects from other companies to provide the enterprise architecture, so the overall architecture of the network. One thing I just wanted to mention is, I mean, you heard a lot about the different use cases that we are deploying and that we are supporting. And even though those are different use cases, they have one thing in common. And that one common thing is that not a single company can resolve those problems by themselves, right? So, I mean, Daniela talked about the CO2 footprint, or we talked about the quality case where we need to track components through the supply chain. None of us, none of the companies, none of the participants have the sole information at hand, right? So it is just about collaboration, right, and making sure that together we can achieve the goals that those use cases are to be delivered. And the same also applies to the architecture, right? If you look at the architecture, it's also not a, well, I would say like a monolithic, solid thing just by itself, right? But it's also a collaboration of many companies, of many different components in a very inclusive and collaborative fashion. And the most important concept that we want to apply and that we are striving for are the two concepts of data sovereignty and interoperability, right? Because if we want to solve those data or those questions that can only be solved with data, then we need to make sure that we design a system or a network that is interoperable, where applications and solutions from different vendors, from different companies can actually talk to each other, can collaborate, and can exchange data, right? On the other hand side, we also know that in many industries, and this is not just exclusive to the automotive industry, but also to other industries, I mean, there's a certain concern for sharing data, right? So every company has certain data that they keep as their intellectual property or keep as a competitive advantage. So we also need to make sure in such a network, right, that we implement data sovereignty, meaning I, as a data owner, can stay in control of my data. I understand what is going to happen, right? So those two topics that you see here are the main fundamental guidelines that we think is also a differentiator within Catena-X. And also it's something that really relates to European values, right? So, and we heard already about Gaia-X as one of the technology foundation of Catena-X. And also Gaia-X is based on European values, right? On the values of sharing data, on trust, on security. I will talk about that also in a moment. If we look at Catena in general, and this is what you see here on the slide, you see that we use what we call on the right-hand side the business applications, right, which is an offering for many different companies. As I said, right, this is not a monolithic approach, but here are various companies are contributing applications to the use cases, like circular economy, like material traceability. And we do have, and we actually do want competition also in that space, right? So there's applications from different vendors providing functionality for the same capabilities, but as I said, in an interoperable way, so that users, customers, consumers have also a choice to participate in that use case with not just a single applications, but with multiple different applications. On the other hand side, if we look at the underlying, what we call here either the operating system or the common network base, right? This is then something where we believe this is something we want to share as a community, as a consortia, right? So, and this network, these network components, they are really making up the Catena-X network, and Catena itself is also the owner of that piece of functionality. SAP, as one of the providers, is member of Catena-X, right? And we are a founding member. So we are, of course, also participating in the network, but there's not a single company owning the network, right? It's really that Catena-X is driving that. And also in comparison to what I said before with the business applications, which could be provided by one or multiple different companies, and which could and will be also offered by different companies. The operating system itself is built on the principles of open source, right? So we are using common open source components, as well as building together the missing components for the network together in the consortia, because here we believe this is something that we all share as a responsibility. We want to make sure that the foundation of the network is transparent, that it can be trusted. So here, open source was chosen as a common way of developing software together in such a consortia setup. And last but not least, we talked about that already, the agile working model and SAFe, right? So we have also chosen to work with this methodology in order to be more flexible than classical waterfall models, where we would actually write specifications for a couple of months, right, and then start into implementing. So we are working in smaller iterations and program increments, 2-week sprints, to really see how does new technology work, how can it be adapted to the different network requirements. So if you look at that, I mean, what is the stake that SAP has, right? You might ask yourself, of course, what we are doing. I mean, we are providing some of the business applications that I was mentioning, right? And here we have two approaches. We approach, first of all, existing applications that we network enable, right? Make sure that they can work in such a collaborative, interoperable scenario as I was describing before. But we are also developing new applications based on the requirements that we have seen in Catena-X. So that's one of the contribution and motivation for us. And the other motivation, of course, we also have quite some experience in the way how networks operate and work, right? I mean, you might know about the asset intelligence network, the digital vehicle hub network, you might have, which are more like industry focused solutions, but also business network solutions like Concur, Fieldglass, SuccessFactors, which are more targeted towards corporate standards. But we believe, I mean, this is also an asset that we can bring. We can contribute that to Catena from a knowledge, from an experience perspective. And last but not least, also to mention, one of the principles that we want to reach with the Catena-X network is to be also an open network. So we sometimes call that also the network of networks. So it shouldn't, I mean, the target is here that we can also collaborate with existing networks, right? So that it's not a single environment where I need to log on and register always individually, but I can also connect between networks. And why is that? And I think Daniela mentioned that also. We believe that this is not just relevant for automotive, it's relevant for many other industries. Plus, the boundary lines of industries are getting more and more blurry anyways, right? So if we look today at the automotive industry, I mean, you will find a lot of companies which are not specifically working in that industry, but they also work in others, right? So being able to connect also different networks for different purposes is something that we believe is absolutely valuable. And this is also one of our design principles here. Maybe if you go to the next slide. then I would now just touch briefly, and again, probably each of those topics is a topic by itself and could be filling a complete session. But I want to touch on 4 of the major technology concepts or foundations that we're using. So I want to elaborate quickly on the question of data spaces, right, and the technology behind there. I want to talk about the way how we want to deal with identities in the future. How do we want to manage a data exchange between companies in a self-sovereign manner? And last but not least, also quickly touch a bit on the concepts of interoperability and what we're doing in that area. So looking at the data spaces, and data spaces is something that we hear frequently, I think a lot. And during the presentation, you heard basically 2 terms. Right? You had the term of Gaia-X. You heard also the term of the IDS, the International Data Spaces. But the concepts are pretty, I mean, from a high-level perspective, pretty similar. Right? It's all about bringing companies, bringing participants together in a data space based on a certain interest, right? That might be an industry or might be a certain problem statement. By bringing those together to allow collaboration, but at the same time ensure that, as I said, the data is being handled in a very self-sovereign manner. So on the Gaia-X, what you see here, you basically see 2 different sections, right? You see the section on top, which is the blue one, which describes the data space or the ecosystem, and Catena-X is pretty much one of those data spaces, right? So there could be also another data space for mobility. There could be a data space for energy, for utilities, right? So also in financial services, I believe there are projects right now based on the Gaia-X principles, building functionality in financial services. So this is really where the business integration or business interaction happens. And then the second part of Gaia-X, which is the lower part, the red part, is the infrastructure. And that's about compute, right? It's about how do we provide technology, compute power, nodes in a more flexible way to such an ecosystem. And in order to operate that, you need 4 different services that you see in the middle, right? You see basically the need for an identity and trust service, because as I said, in such a decentralized environment, you want to make sure that you know who the partner is that you are talking to. You want to understand if these partners can be trusted. Do they have a trust anchor? So somebody proving that this partner is really the partner they are pretending to be. So that's one of the core foundations for such an ecosystem, right? The second one is the sovereign data exchange. We'll talk about that also on a detailed slide. But it's about, I mean, how do I make sure that data is exchanged in a trustworthy and sovereign manner? As I said, we'll look at that. The third big component that such a data space requires is a concept of discoverability, right? Which basically is manifested in the topic of federated catalogs, right? And if I now join such a network, I want to understand what assets, what offerings does that data space provide, right? In our scenario that we talked about before, where could I get product carbon footprint data, right? Or where would I be able to receive certain quality information that I need for a specific scenario, or other digital twin information that is available as part of the network, right? So the catalog really allows us to discover which information is available in such a network and where can I retrieve the information from. And then last but not least, the fourth aspect of such a network is the aspect of compliance, because you want to make sure that participants in those networks, they are certified, they have a certain, also their trustworthiness. So the idea with Catena with Gaia-X is also to provide those kind of compliance rules relationships. There's also a labeling system that Gaia is currently collecting or drafting, which would basically describe what kind of service level, what kind of trust level those artifacts within the network would provide, right? So, for example, there will be a label on data protection, right? Also on localization of data, also on certification if certain certifications have been fulfilled. So this is all being summarized under the compliance topic. And again, Catena-X as one data space, we believe that Gaia-X is the right foundation for us to build our use cases on. And on the right-hand side, you see also, I mean, some of the major principles we were talking about before, right? So also Gaia-X heavily relies on decentralization, right? So the catalogs, there shouldn't be like a single catalog just in the middle, right? There shouldn't be a single data lake that consumes and collects all the data, but data is rather be held distributed and used on an as needed basis. So if we just switch to the next slide. So the second aspect that we see as technology foundation in the network is decentralized identities, which some of you might know as also as self-sovereign identities, SSI. And what's the difference there, right? So in a let's say classical identity management scenario, I mean, you would have an identity provider, right? And that identity provider kind of owns your identity. And we see that on the left-hand side, if it's me, you, Mark, Tom, or Alice, right? They might have a Google Plus ID, they might have a Facebook ID, they might have some IDs in the corporate systems, but at the end, a central identity provider is managing and maintaining their identity, which also then, on the other hand side, would offer the risk that if that identity is being cut off, then I wouldn't be able to use services in the network, right? So if I would use Facebook as an example, right, as my identity provider, and then use Strava or Booking or you name it, all the nice other applications that you might use as a private person, right? But if that identity is then cut off, then I'm cut off from all of the other services. And self-sovereign identity actually flips that concept around and basically says, well, I as an individual, I'm the holder of my identity, right? So I'm managing that, I'm keeping that. Of course, there is an issuer of an identity, right? And that issuer needs to do an attestation who I am. But essentially, I'm keeping that identity and I'm also free to share with services or with other parties in the network what pieces of an identity I want to share. And also the level of granularity. And one of the, I think, easy to understand examples, there's also, if you want to go and buy alcohol, right? I mean, the typical thing is you go to a cashier and you show your ID, right? And then they basically look at your ID and say, okay, your birth date is a certain date, and they would say, okay, you're either allowed or not allowed to buy alcohol, right? But you're also disclosing maybe some other information, right? You're also disclosing your address information. You're disclosing maybe some identifiers. So other things that are not relevant for that particular use case. In the self-sovereign identity, the concept is more like I keep my identity in my wallet and I can share the needed information with my partners. I had that also here. I mean, many initiatives are currently looking at that. I mean, Gaia-X is one of the big consumers of SSI. We are also looking at how can we identify resources in the network with SSI. And there are various, let's say, underlying networks like ID Union, also like ION from Microsoft that we are working with. So there is infrastructure that is available. And what is more important, even as important as I mentioned it before, I mean, it's based on open W3C standards, right? So we're not inventing something by ourselves, but self-sovereign identity uses decentralized identities or identifiers, DIDs, and verifiable credentials also for the cryptographic path of it. So something that is, again, contributing to the openness of the network, to the open concepts that we want to embrace with Catena-X. So that's the second foundational building block. If we go to the third one, it's the self-sovereign data exchange, right? And this is something that is very dear to our hearts because it's one of the core principles, as I mentioned before, right? So what is it all about? The concept of self-sovereign data exchange assumes that I, as a data owner, I want to stay in control of what happens to my data, right? So in the ecosystem or data space scenario I was describing, I would say I, as a data owner, I have some data artifacts or assets that I want to share, right? So I would say, okay, this is the information I'm willing to share. I would register those then in a broker or federated catalog. Depends a little bit on some concepts call it broker, others catalog, but it's the same, right? So I would register basically what are the offerings that I have that I would be willing to share, but I would at the same time also attach a usage policy to it, right? So I would basically say, okay, this is the data I'm willing to share, but I would share that only either for a specific purpose or for a specific time, right? Or I would say you can use it only 3 times or for the next 30 days. So all those kind of usage policies, I would also attach to my data offering, right? And that would then be able to be discovered within the network by a consumer, right? So a data consumer could then go into the network, into the broker service or the catalog, searching for a certain type of information that he or she needs. And then basically, if he finds the right assets, then before the physical data flow happens, there would be a contract negotiation, right? So between the provider connector and the consumer connector, there will be a negotiation about do they agree to the usage policies that were attached with the data. And if only in that case, right, then data would be actually shared with the consumer. The data transfer would also be logged by an independent instance. So that it's also transparent and clear what data has been exchanged, when has it exchanged, for which purpose, and under which usage conditions. This concept, again, is something that Gaia embraces, but also the international data spaces has this concept for quite some while. We started also with the IDS concept. Over the course of the last year, we as a consortia realized that we want to also bring this kind of connector architecture to the next level. And that's something that you see on the slide on the right-hand side, where it says open source Eclipse data space connector, right? So we started with a classical connector from IDS. We now have an open source project, which is called the Eclipse Data Space Connector. So it's an Eclipse Foundation project under the Apache software license, where many companies are contributing to this type of connector architecture or data space architecture, right? So just to name a few, there's Fraunhofer, of course, involved as the originator, Microsoft in there, Mercedes, SAP, T-Systems, Amadeus, BMW, right? So this is another point where we say this is something we all need, and we also believe this is not specific to the automotive industry, but it's a concept of how to build and operate in those kind of data spaces. So it's something that we dearly believe it makes a lot of sense to develop that in a joint open source based approach. We also linked or put some links here on the slides. If you want to get more information, there's a GitHub repo that those of you who are interested in the coding can see. You will also see the issues where the connector stands right now. But that's the third foundational component that we use in the consortia. And then last but not least, if we go to the next slide, interoperability we also mentioned a couple of times, right? So, and as I said, I mean, that has all kinds of levels, right? From the applications, where we of course want to make sure that applications from different vendors can talk to each other, can complement information in order to build data chains and to build chains of information across 2, 3, 4, 5 different tiers. So that's interoperability, but then of course there's also interoperability more from a technology perspective. So we want to use open standards like OIDC in the identity management. We are using that temporarily right now. So it's not about using a particular product, right? So saying, I mean, this is the identity product that we want to use, but we rather say we want to use this protocol and ensure that companies who want to participate are supporting the protocol rather than need to adapt to a certain commercial product, right? So that's also part of the interoperability that we are implementing. And just to give you 2 examples of where do we see interoperability. On the left-hand side, you see a diagram also taken from the Gaia-X architecture from the federated services, right, where basically this component of the federated catalog is being described, which uses a lot of Web3 technology. So you see RDF there as an example. And you see, yeah, JSON LD and so on, right? So here we are taking also the specifications from Gaia, looking at those. Right now we have implemented a first release for ourselves because the services are still under development, but definitely this is something we adopt as soon as the Gaia-X services are available. Because as I said, I mean, they are also embracing open source, they're embracing open technology standards like the resource description framework, right? Or like the JSON linked data, JSON LD format. So definitely something from a technology perspective we are focusing on. And then from an industry interoperability perspective, you see that on the right-hand side, we are also heavily embracing the asset administration shell, which is also an open source project from the International Digital Twin Association, IDTA, coming out of the Industry 4.0 history, right? And what we are doing there is also that we are building together with a consortia, with the teams, we are building so-called submodels or aspects for specific data artifacts. For example, the product carbon footprint aspect, right? So we're describing how a product carbon footprint aspect would look of a different component, describing that in a generic, easy to understand format, and exposing that via an asset administration shell interface, so that no matter where that digital twin, this asset really lives, but it can be discovered, it can be found and accessed via the asset administration shell interfaces and APIs. So again, that's also something that we believe is essential to such an open and interoperable network. All right, having said that, I think we're almost done. 2 words to the roadmap, maybe. So as we said, we started the project in August 2021, so almost a year ago. We said we had this development cooperation, right? There was an association, a German Verein, founded, which is the governing body. We submitted the government funding application and so on. And started officially 1st of August with the consortia. We are roughly looking at 3 different phases of the project. So first phase is the networking basics, right? The environments, the foundational topics I was just mentioning, to bring this into place, to also ensure that we have a solution that is user-friendly and that is also attractive not only to large companies, because as you can imagine, such a network, such an ecosystem only works if many companies are participating, right? And in such a supply chain scenario, you don't only need the big players, right, the big kids on the block, but you also need, of course, the small and mid-sized companies, the ones that are heavily contributing into the value chain of the automotive industry, right? So that's why user friendliness is also a big concern for us. So that will be first phase 1, right? And then phase 2, we basically say we are going into a scalability mode, where we want to increase the adoption and the amount of partners. And last but not least, in phase 3, we also want to, also want to look at a more international scaling basis, right? So because we already see that there's a huge interest, not just within the German automotive industry, but also internationally. And as I mentioned before, also from other industries, to think about how could they either contribute or how could we build a network of networks where different networks or different data spaces from different industries can collaborate and exchange data. Good. With that said, I think we are done with the content. Here's just also reference to where do you get more information, but we hand that out anyways. So then I would hand it over back to Laura, I guess.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Thomas. And thanks, Daniela, as well for the presentation. And with that, I'd like to open up the Q&A. So please, everyone who's now watching and joining us in YouTube here live, please feel free to post your questions for Thomas and Daniela in the chat here. And we do have 2 questions I've seen from Carsten Puschke. So hi, Carsten, thanks for posting them. The first question, and he says is more of a business-related question, is the following. Is the Catena-X platform only available for existing supply chains, meaning existing business partners who share their data in it? Or can I also consider it as a marketplace in the sense that I can offer comparable services, goods, or semi-finished products at better conditions?
Should I? Or, I mean, I think, yeah. I mean, first of all, I mean, it's of course right now focused on the consortium members and then the association members, right? But having said that, I mean, there is a scalability approach, as I showed before. One of the aspects we also have is a second life or second material marketplace, right? Where basically, if a car comes back into the recycling process, the recycler would look at the materials that are part of that car, right? Would dismantle the different parts, and then there's a marketplace also that, I mean, for us, from a consumer perspective, kind of an eBay approach, right? Where you can basically also then sell and buy secondary materials. So from that perspective, it's also an open one that not only the original companies could contribute. Okay,
thanks, Thomas. And then the second question, also from Carsten, was if I, for example, exchange data with my business partners on Catena-X and then determine together with them that a new type of application should be built that does not yet exist in this form, do I then have to work here with my own software developer capacities? Or is the platform here also so flexible and collaborative that you can commission, outsource such a new app development?
Yeah, I can also take that maybe. And the idea, I haven't talked about that bit, that the idea is really to also engage or bring Catena as a developer ecosystem forward, right? So right now, of course, we as the consortia partners, we are building the initial use cases, but of course we see that the scalability can only reach with a broader developer community, right? So we are really looking also at those federated, also the services that I was showing earlier, to make them available, as development kits, right, or as development procedures, so that other partners could also then build applications on top of Catena. So it shouldn't be limited to just the initial development partners that we have right now.
Okay, perfect. Carsten, I hope Thomas has well answered your questions then. And yeah, that were all questions that we have in the chat so far. So still, if anyone has a question, post them. Maybe in the meantime, I ask you both, Thomas and Daniela, to maybe summarize the call and give us each, let's say, 3 to 5 key takeaways that you think our listeners and the community members should remember from today's session. Whoever wants to go first, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I can start. So one important takeaway is that we are really on a new path here with a kind of decentralized networks, so that everybody has the responsibility and the ownership of their own data, and that you will not provide data to others which are not authorized and which are not use the data as it was foreseen by the provider. And I think only in this way you can actually reach the goal to have an overview of the overall supply chain, because so far you can only look one step back or one step forward in your supply chain, but you will not reach the transparency of the overall thing. So that's why I think the decentralized network is a very important thing, combined with the principle of data sovereignty. So maybe Thomas, you can continue.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also, I mean, from an software development and community approach, I think is also one thing that I think I made clear, that this is something where we really need to collaborate. And I think also the problems of the future are just too big to just be a single-minded company, right? So this is something that I see in many, because and we saw the logos, right? There's a lot of different companies in the program, right, with different, of course, experience, with different mindsets. And I think really, I mean, it shows that we can collaborate, and that we can, when we can collaborate, we also bring a greater good to the community, right? So I think this is also something that is quite essential for Catena-X as a network. Yeah, I think this is probably my takeaway.
Okay, perfect. Thank you both. Thanks. Yeah, and with that, thanks everyone for joining. And again, as I said in the beginning, so the recording will be available directly after the call under the same link. There will also be the slide deck being shared soon with you underneath the video in the description, just down below, for you to download. And you might have seen that I posted some links in the chat. So I posted both community profiles from Daniela and Thomas. So feel free to follow them in the SAP community and reach out to them in case you have any further questions regarding Catena-X. And yeah, also if you have questions, feel free to post them in the SAP community directly. I also provide the link there. And if you're interested to see what other upcoming SAP community events we have, and also upcoming community calls, yeah, feel free to visit our new events page in groups to find all the details there. And with that being said, maybe some closing words from your side, if you'd like, and then I would close the call for today.
I would just say thank you, Laura, for hosting us. I think it was a pleasure. Thanks for all the support. And yeah, I hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Yeah, thanks also from my side. Have a nice day. Bye.
Thanks both as well. It was nice. Yeah, everyone, thanks for joining. Take care and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.